The lights came back on, but no one moved. Outside, the rain pressed against the stained glass like 1,000 unheard voices. Inside, the atmosphere felt suspended between confrontation and confession. Jonathan remained at the pulpit, hands trembling slightly, eyes scanning the pews where familiar faces avoided his gaze. In the second row sat Reverend Ellis's widow, wrapped in a simple black shawl, unmoved, unreadable. Her presence was a quiet verdict. She hadn't come for an apology. She'd come to hear the truth that never arrived when her husband was mocked. On national television, Jonathan exhaled, his breath catching with the weight of memory. The dream had shaken something loose inside him, something he'd buried beneath contracts, praise, and rehearsed humility. And now, in front of strangers and cameras, he had to resurrect what remained of his conscience. The dream had not come gently. It wasn't golden light or divine comfort. It was fire and soil, echoes and silence. He had seen Jesus walking through a modern street, not Rome, not Jerusalem, but somewhere between a protest and a prayer vigil. Jesus had passed him without words, then turned. "You watched them beat me with microphones," he said, "and you smiled." That line had broken him. He woke up gasping. Night after night, the dream returned, each time darker, more detailed. Jesus looked like the men dismissed as threats, whose voices were cut from televised debates, whose stories were always too uncomfortable to center. Jonathan knew the dream wasn't fiction. It was memory not his own, but one he'd chosen to ignore for too long. The church was quiet now, expectant. From somewhere behind, a journalist whispered, "Is this a confession or a stunt?" Jonathan heard it, but didn't react. The real audience wasn't in the pews. It was the boy in Detroit who'd posted Reverend Ellis's final sermon online. It was the intern who once quietly left his studio after telling him, "Silence is a choice." It was the grieving wife who hadn't spoken a word since arriving. And it was Jesus, not the marketable, softened image, but the one who'd bled in alleys and cried in courtrooms and whispered in dreams. Jonathan's voice broke the silence once more. "I didn't come to reclaim anything. I came to lay something down." That sentence carried the ache of months, the regret of smiling through pain, the betrayal of hiding behind neutrality, the guilt of being praised for being apolitical while others lost everything for simply being seen. The candle beside him flickered, casting shadows across the altar. A child near the back asked his mother, "Who is that man?" She leaned down, answered quietly, "Someone who's late," and in that moment, Jonathan closed his eyes, just for a second. He remembered the sound of Reverend Ellis's voice. Calm, direct, filled with the fire of generations. He remembered being in awe of that dignity and still choosing silence when Ellis was ridiculed. The dream hadn't been a warning. It was a mirror, and tonight he faced it. He stepped down from the podium slowly, his final words still hanging in the air. "What Jesus showed me wasn't his pain. It was ours, the one I refused to carry." A choir member behind him let out a single, trembling note, not a song, but a sound of mourning. The screen at the back of the church went black. No message, no logo, just darkness, waiting to be filled. His team panicked. Publicists drafted statements laced with scripture and softened accountability. "Say you were misunderstood," one advised. Another suggested mentioning exhaustion, overwork, and grief. But Jonathan rejected every version. "I don't want to be forgiven for staying silent," he told them. "I want people to know what silence costs." Meetings with executives turned cold. Studio heads began distancing themselves. A major Christian network postponed their upcoming broadcast featuring Jonathan. Quietly, brands pulled back. Emails once filled with praise turned to polite cancellations. His phone still rang, but mostly with people asking what he planned to say, not what he had learned. And the dream kept coming. Jesus, silent, exhausted, standing in front of burning buildings, tear gas in the sky, looking at him. Not angry, just empty. Flashbacks threaded through these quiet collapses. A panel years ago, Jonathan nodding while a guest downplayed police brutality. Another flash backstage, ignoring a black janitor's attempt at conversation as he rushed to rehearsal. None of it hateful, all of it comfortable, all of it safe. But now, the safety felt poisonous. The dream became a compass, forcing him back through each moment. He chose peace over principle. He began to rewatch clips of Ellis's sermons, listening not just to the words, but the weight behind them. The steady, defiant faith, the kind that survives mockery, not by resisting it with volume, but by outlasting it with truth. Jamels, Video continued to ripple. Schools played it in social justice forums. Church youth groups dissected it. One viral comment read, "Jonathan was paid to act like Jesus. Ellis lived like him." That single sentence burned through the internet. Protesters weren't asking for Jonathan to disappear. They were demanding something rarer, confrontation. Not with others, with himself. And slowly, he obliged. He visited Ellis's old church at night, wearing a hoodie and mask, sitting in the back during a community forum. No one recognized him. He listened to people speak not about him, but about the feeling of being unheard, unseen, unguarded. He watched a young girl say, "I'm tired of praying to a God people only respect when he looks like them," and he wept quietly in the shadows. No one saw. But something inside him cracked deeper. When he returned home, he took down every award, every framed poster of the films he once thought were sacred. He replaced them with Ellis's quotes, printed from a blog long buried in search results. One read, "If your silence makes power feel safe, it's not faith, it's fear." That one stayed taped above his desk. Another whisper came days later. A sound technician he'd worked with for years called and said, "I always wondered why you never spoke up. You were the only one they'd listen to." Jonathan didn't argue. He just said, "I know." That call ended in silence, but it wasn't empty anymore. It echoed. A final flashback flickered in his mind, a rehearsal for a crucifixion scene in one of his films. He remembered hanging from the cross prop, eyes closed, pretending to suffer, and Ellis standing at the edge of the set that day, watching. He hadn't said much, just nodded. But now, that nod felt like a question. "Will you still carry the cross when the cameras are gone?" That question drove Jonathan back to the pulpit. Not for clarity, not for redemption, but for confession. As the protests thickened and online pressure mounted, he refused press interviews, refused documentary offers. He didn't want to be featured. He wanted to be present. And so, on that rainy Sunday, with the choir behind him and the storm outside, he asked for the microphone again, not to preach, not to act, but to finally tell the truth that had been fermenting in silence. And the dream stopped returning, as if Jesus no longer needed to repeat himself. As the final words of the letter hung in the cathedral's thick air, Jonathan lowered the paper with trembling hands. His voice had not risen. There had been no theatrics, but something had ruptured in the silence, not just in the room, but in the public narrative that had surrounded him like a shield. Behind him, the choir's hum grew a little louder, no words still, just breath turned into ache. He looked out across the pews, locking eyes with strangers who had judged him, defended him, abandoned him, prayed for him. Their expressions were different now, not softened but stilled, humbled perhaps by witnessing not a performance, but the slow undoing of pride. The screens flickered again. A compilation played Ellis at marches, Ellis in flooded neighborhoods, Ellis speaking at city halls with fire in his eyes. Not curated clips, but raw moments of grit. The kind of leadership the world ignored unless it bled. Jonathan stepped aside, letting Ellis fill the space. His voice from a past sermon echoed through the cathedral's sound system. "The cross isn't a stage. It's a sentence. If you carry it for applause, you're just acting." It wasn't lost on anyone that those words had been spoken while Jonathan was starring in a film about Jesus. Now, Ellis's voice was the loudest one in the room, even in death. Jonathan returned to the microphone, but didn't touch it. He let the silence breathe, let Ellis's legacy stand untouched. Finally, he spoke again. "I wore robes. I memorized scripture. I wept on cue, but I didn't weep when it mattered." His voice cracked there. "I thought reverence was enough. But reverence without courage is cowardice in disguise." The choir stopped humming, not abruptly, as if something had resolved in the music too. No one instructed them. They just knew. From the balcony, a teenage girl, maybe 17, stood up. She didn't raise a sign. She didn't yell. She just asked, "Why now?" Jonathan turned slowly toward her, not defensive, because shame doesn't change anything. But if it breaks you in the right place, something better can grow. His answer didn't satisfy everyone. It wasn't meant to, but the honesty of it did something. Words really do. It lingered. One by one, people began standing, not clapping, just rising. A silent protest turned into a quiet communion. Ellis's widow remained seated, still unreadable, her face heavy with memory. Jonathan didn't beg for her blessing. He simply said, "You carried him when the world mocked him. I let them. You've already done enough. I just hope what I build next doesn't insult what he died carrying." A man in the third row whispered under his breath, "This ain't a sermon. This is surrender." The comment wasn't meant to be heard by many, but its truth spread like ash in the air. Outside, protesters remained gathered in the rain. Someone set up a screen to stream the service. As Jonathan's speech neared its end, the camera cut to Ellis's old congregation watching from their own church. They weren't cheering. They were quiet, the kind of quiet that means something has shifted, but no one's sure what yet. One elder from that church stood and said, "Let's see what he does next. Words are just clouds. I want to see rain." Back inside, Jonathan reached for the small wooden cross necklace hidden beneath his shirt. It wasn't part of a costume. It was one Ellis had gifted him years ago, back when they first met during a charity event. He'd forgotten it in a drawer. Until last night. As he held it up briefly, the cameras caught it. Some watching at home recognized it. A gift returned in spirit, now worn with meaning. He didn't give a benediction. No final call to action. He stepped back from the mic and simply said, "This isn't the end of my silence. It's the start of my listening." The organ began to hum low, not triumphant, but steady like breath coming back after grief. As he walked off stage, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled. And in that release, the reckoning began not for just one man, but for the millions who saw themselves. In the mirror he held up, the air is quieter now. Not absent of noise, but stripped of performance. Jonathan moves through the world without the constant echo of recognition. There are no flashes, no murmurs trailing him. Where he once stood beneath studio lights, he now sits among folding chairs and chipped paint. His days are slow, filled with coffee brewed by volunteers and stories told by children who haven't yet learned how to filter their truth. When he speaks, it's to small groups, not about redemption, but responsibility. He doesn't bring cameras. He doesn't share updates. The silence that once condemned him now teaches him how to listen. Some nights, he walks alone to the edge of South Atlanta's oldest district, where the streets still remember Ellis's voice. A few blocks down from the church stands the mural, bold, weather-worn, unmissable. Ellis's face is painted mid-sentence, not smiling, not solemn, just present. Beside him, in stark lettering, "Silence is the loudest betrayal." Jonathan doesn't speak when he visits. He simply kneels, unfolds the once crumpled letter he read aloud, and places it beneath the mural, now laminated by time and tears. No one watches. There's no gesture to be praised, just the quiet, ongoing work of remembrance. Inside a modest community theater, he helps repaint the backdrop for a youth production. The walls smell of sawdust and acrylic. The students don't know all his roles. Some call him Mr. J, others just John. When one girl struggles with a line, he doesn't correct her performance, he asks what the character feels. Acting, he tells them, isn't pretending. It's telling the truth louder than you're used to. They listen, not because of who he was, but because of how he listens back. His hands, once manicured for camera close-ups, are now ink-stained and calloused, guiding, not performing. One afternoon, during break, a boy no older than 10 studies him from across the rehearsal floor. He walks up and asks, "You were famous, weren't you?" Jonathan doesn't flinch. He smiles, not regretfully, not proudly, just honestly. "I was loud," he says. "Now I'm trying to be true." The boy nods, not needing more. The moment passes like a small breeze, enough to stir, not to disrupt. Later that week, Jonathan returns to the church where everything unraveled and began again. No congregation today, no pulpit waiting, just space. He walks the aisle slowly, stops beneath the stained glass panel he once stood under, trembling. It's different now. The Jesus in the glass no longer looks like marketing. His skin is dark. His hands are cracked. Around him are protesters, children, preachers, workers. The scene is not heavenly, it's here. The divine among the unheard. Jonathan gazes upward, letting the light from the colored glass touch his face. He doesn't cry. He doesn't pray out loud. He just breathes. As the camera pulls back, a voiceover begins, his voice, aged only by awareness. "Jesus didn't tell me I was evil. He told me I had a choice. I finally made one." The screen begins to fade. Not fast, just slowly, gently. Like a curtain drawing after the final act, not because the show is over, but because it's time to leave the stage and live differently. The last image is a quiet one, the mural again, letter still resting beneath it, caught in a breeze. And over it, the final words appear in white against black: "God doesn't need your fame. He needs your courage, Reverend Ellis."